I was just having a cup of tea with Luang Por before coming here. It was very sweet to see him and enjoying his old age and the privileges of being a senior citizen. He sits next to me on the couch and he pats my knee and says, I don't have to give a talk tonight, right? There's no, Luang Por, you're off the hook. And then as I left, I said, I see you later, Luang Por. And he says, may it all go well, and may you answer all questions properly. So I hope I do honor to that. So I can't keep up with you guys and your questions. I'll try my best. Dear Ajahn, the question I have for you invariably pop up during meditation. Sometimes I forget it after the session, like in a dream. Sometimes I have to cling to it to remember after the session. So the question is, am I meditating right? I think this question came up, was written a day or two ago, and I only got to it now. But I hope that with all the instruction from these last 2 days, you got the answer to that question. Basically using Dhamma Vichaya to investigate, and then using these 4 powers, the Itipadas, aspiration, effort, how we set our hearts on our goals, and then reviewing. And that's how you can appreciate whether your practice is leading to the right results. Can I cultivate better conscious awareness if I see myself as a third person or a body? For example, this body is craving food right now. This body is sleepy and lazy at the moment. How to have the knower. So, in a way, yes, it's okay to use that because it is the body that experiences hunger. But in terms of seeing the body as non-self, it's also useful to recognize the limitations of using the third person, because the third person is still a person. So it does help initially to kind of ask to or review these things and rephrase them instead of saying, I'm hungry, it's the body that's hungry. But I'd recommend just keeping it at that rather than making it into a third person. Dear Ajahn, you said that one needs only just enough concentration to utilize vipassana. If that is the case, does one need only just enough morality to have just enough concentration? Do we need to be perfect in everything to attain liberation? Well, in Thailand, they have 2 different Pali formulas to us to request the precepts. One of them is, how's it go? Mayang bante ti saranena saha pancha or atta silani yachami. And another one is wisung ratanataya. And the first time I asked, I never heard that before. It's sort of my second year as a monk or something, the first time I heard that formula being used. And I said, what's that? Ajahn, we're lay people. Sometimes we cannot keep all precepts, so we say that so we can choose the ones we keep. I said, oh, that's very convenient. But in the light of the last part of the question, do we have to be perfect in everything we do? Well, perfection is kind of a very difficult thing to attain. It's an ideal, isn't it? And if we try to keep perfect morality, we're probably going to run into a lot of suffering. Like as a junior monk, I tried to keep all the rules, all the refinement of the rules and everything, and it's very, very difficult to do. And when we look at what the purpose of precepts are, they're for the sake of training, for the sake of practicing restraint, for the sake of mindfulness as well. Like there's so many rules for the monks, and some people, inevitably when we're getting familiar with the rules, we feel kind of hemmed in, we're like in a straitjacket, and it feels very uncomfortable. And it's probably a very rare monk who hasn't thought of the Vinaya and threw it in with a couple of four-letter words at some point or another. Because it feels like that, it's difficult, it's frustrating. And also because we keep so many rules that you keep doubting, did I commit an offense? And doubt is not very comfortable either. But as we get to know them and we get to know how to lead our life with these monastic rules, we become more comfortable with it. And it's really something that it hems us in, and it prevents all this energy from going all over the place, but then this energy is contained and it becomes useful. And you can start making that an energy available for the practice. But it's also just a way of practicing mindfulness. Like at any given time of the day, any given activity, a monk has to review, how do I do this according to the rules? And so we can use it as a tool to just come back to here and now rather than kind of go on autopilot and live our days like that. So the 5 precepts, they're basically guidelines, and when we keep the precepts as best we can according to our situation to begin with, and then in the Noble Eightfold Path, the Noble Eightfold Path is sometimes these 8 factors of the path, these 8 aspects of the path can be grouped into 3 different groups. There's wisdom, there's morality, and there's concentration. And there are 8 aspects of one path. So it's not 8 parts, and you walk down one for a while, and when you get bored with that, and you change and go to another one. It doesn't work like that. It's really just one path, and these 8 aspects, the 3 aspects, wisdom, morality, and concentration, they go together. So say we start observing 5 precepts and we keep a certain level of these precepts, and then as we live our lives and we run into situations that would challenge our behavior in regards to these 5 precepts, we remember them and we go, oh no, this one I don't want to do that. First we can think, I don't want to break the precepts, we're holding the precept, but then using wisdom, so the morality part of the path is keeping the precepts, but then the wisdom part of the path is also looking at why we're keeping precepts, because this course of action leads to suffering for myself and others. And then the concentration part of the path is also what allows us to keep track. We stay with things for long enough to realize that a certain course of behavior leads to this kind of result. And people who don't have enough mindfulness and absolutely no concentration have a hard time keeping precepts or seeing the point in keeping precepts, because they don't have enough mindfulness, enough wisdom to just connect the result and the suffering with the cause. It was the behavior that's not according to the 5 precepts. And as we do this, so basically it's really these 3 aspects work together. And as we develop the path, they become more and more refined. So at the beginning we say, for example, the 4th precept is not to lie. So we try to not lie, except white lies. And we convince ourselves, and we go and see the Ajahn, and we said, white lies are okay, aren't they? And the Ajahn goes, well... And you kind of try to negotiate and bargain, and eventually you realize, well, even a white lie is still a lie. The intention is good, but it's still a distortion of the truth, a misrepresentation of reality. And then you realize there are another 3 aspects to right speech. Is refraining from coarse speech, refraining from malicious and divisive speech, backbiting, and the 4th one is refraining from idle speech. And it becomes more and more refined, like holding back the 4-letter words might not be that much of an effort. And then not indulging in a bit of criticism and gossip, that becomes harder because it's more of a habit that we may have. And we learn to restrain that little by little, but then gossip, idle speech, what qualifies as idle speech? Well, in the purest definition of the term, is anything that's not connected with Dhamma or beneficial to the practice. Basically, there's not a lot of talking left. So it's not easy to do that. And at first we're like, oh, it's okay, it's kind of harmless. There are no lies, there's no coarse language, there's no malicious backbiting, it's harmless. And in a way, it's true. But then as your meditation develops, and that stillness of the mind starts developing, you're going to reach a certain point where you realize that talking about politics and talking about history and movies and shopping and fashion and the neighbors and whatnot, even if you're not indulging in any kind of the other kinds of what we call bad speech, you're still sending the mind out a lot to the movies, to the neighbors, to the shopping, to politics and all of that kind of stuff. And when we spend time doing that, then when we sit down and we want to bring the mind back inwards, we realize, well, we've just let it run for a while, so it's going to take time to rope it back in. And then you start feeling an interest. At some point, the meditation, the practice starts taking priority, starts having more importance than the enjoyment of gossip and chit-chat and whatnot. And little by little, you start kind of bringing it in. You stop going to the pub, even if your friends are drinking beer and you're drinking tea or milk. And you say, never mind. And so these kind of aspects, they develop together. So just enough morality really is depending on your understanding of the precepts. So it depends on the wisdom, and it goes hand in hand with the amount of stillness that you can bring to the investigation, the contemplation of that. For arahants, how are they witnessing, observing when they need to actively think and plan and speak? Is their awareness constant like background noise, a sound of silence despite the thinking, or are they actively speaking, thinking, etc., and then maintaining body awareness, flitting in and out of this, but always remaining mindful? And where the question is coming from is, I'm trying to understand how to be aware during thinking, planning, etc., so the practice can continue. So I can't answer for the arahant, because I'm not part of the club yet. But, thinking is the tool we use to plan. And what I can speak from is I have a bit of in terms of character traits, the package came with a lot of idealism, and I found myself to be a perfectionist. And before I could use Dhamma to contemplate that, when I lay down plans, especially looking after Luang Por, the first couple of years I was looking after him, I tried to plan everything right, and then life happens, and the plans go askew. And I'd find myself sometimes getting just really upset with some of these things, and just getting angry and impatient, and it all came from being attached to the plan and wanting things to follow the plan. And from that grasping, then anything that's not according to the plan is basically not getting what I want, because what I want is the plan, and things are otherwise. And if the mindfulness is not there yet to realize a plan is just a plan, we make a plan now for this evening, for tomorrow, for the 15th, the closing of the retreat, the future is still uncertain, and in the present this is a plan. So if we're planning according to reality, it means we know it's just a plan, and then the plan will at some point come in contact with reality, and it may go according to plan or not, and then we have to adjust. And that's the wisdom of understanding the way things are, brought to planning and thinking. But it's interesting to see, like when I was in Wat Nong Papong, one day the monks were pouring this concrete pedestal towards the front of the monastery. When you enter the front gate of the monastery, first there's this large roundabout with a museum in it, and in front of that roundabout, Luang Por Liam placed one of the statues, a standing posture like this of the Buddha with his hand out, a very beautiful one. And he raised it on a pedestal, and they were casting the pedestal. And there's one of his monks who ordained with him just after Luang Por Cha passed away. So he's one of his closest disciples and hardest work monks. And he was helping him, and Luang Por Liam was trying to do things one way, and this monk, who was then probably something like 17, 18 vasa, he knew that wouldn't work, and he was trying to tell Luang Por not to do it that way. It doesn't work, and Luang Por just kept doing it, and it's like, no, Luang Por, you can't do it like that, and Luang Por didn't listen, so he shouted at Luang Por, Luang Por, my chai! And I was like, what's happening here? Someone shouting at Luang Por. And I just watched what was happening, and I realized, for many things Luang Por knows what he's doing, but being an arahant doesn't mean you know everything about everything. You can still make mistakes. And so thinking is just a tool that we use in life. But often, like what the Buddha referred to, or it was one of his disciples, I think, was referring to as like what the arahant knows when he knows the ending of all suffering. He knows the nature of the mind and of the body, and he's completely let go of it, but the body's still here. So you still use it, you still feed it. An arahant can still love his noodle soup. It must still be his favorite food, but he's not attached to it. But still, it might be the food he likes best and enjoys best. But he's not coming from desire. It doesn't mean he's not going to have it. And so in terms of operating in daily life, speaking, thinking, planning, they have to do it the same way we have to do it. But in terms of that enlightenment, they don't necessarily have to stay with it all the time. It's not something they have to hold on to because it's just there. And one of the senior monks was referring to it as a little bit like when you tie your shoes, you lace your shoes, you know you did it. You can trust it. They'll stay on your feet. You don't have to check every second of the day to make sure they're tied. So they know this awareness is kind of the background of all things. It's the space in which everything arises and ceases. And when they need to go back to it, or then have nothing else to do, they don't have to think, plan, talk, or do anything, then that's where they come back to rest in this kind of freedom, in the emptiness of the mind. And then when it's time to engage with the world, then they engage. Are all the stories in the Dhammapada true events during the Buddha's time? There's a unique story of a man who's married with children, and one day he saw a monk and was awed by the good looks of the monk. After that thought, he became a woman and left the place he lived as he was too embarrassed to stay. Now as a woman, he stayed in another place, met a man, got married, and gave birth to 2 children. She, so this person who turned into a woman, met an old friend from where she previously lived and told the friend who he was formerly. She was told to ask forgiveness from the monk. And I cannot remember the ending. Could you help explain this story, please? It seems a bit hard to believe. I agree. these days, like Luang Por was mentioning this morning, trans, they don't just become trans because they saw somebody good looking of the opposite sex and boop, you kind of have to go through surgery. I don't know if all the stories in the Dhammapada are true or not, but reading kind of stories that are supposed to convey wisdom from various traditions, like the Upanishads and the origins, the kind of foundational stories of the Hindu religion, of the Jewish religion, even the 1001 Nights. A lot of stories in there that you sometimes find as kind of stories that are told in poems in different language for children, a little story that bears a moral. And sometimes you find those same stories in different traditions, and so I've come across some of those in the Dhammapada. So I have no idea if they're all true, but in a way that's not the point, because the point of the story is to convey a point of wisdom. Usually in the Dhammapada it's wisdom also tied in with some past life stories of the Buddha or of his disciples. Like a lot of the Jataka stories are like that as well. So what's important is more the point of wisdom, of understanding that the story is trying to convey. If you can give that priority and kind of gloss over some of the less believable details of the stories, I think you come out all right. During one of my sittings yesterday, one is coming to an end, I had a sudden feel of concentration. Therefore, I let go of my feeling on my breath and focused on the concentration, and I feel a smooth batch of red color appear in front of me and feel some happiness by focusing on the color. But in view of the teaching, finally, I still let go of it, and rather than chasing after the feeling. That's a little bit like that point about nimittas. Like someone was asking about nimittas. That's basically what it is. And you'll find that in the development of this stillness, we use an object, and it's very often good to stick with one object, because sometimes you get a bit bored with it, and then we try something else. And that other thing works, it kind of holds our attention better for a while. And then we go back to the first one. And then we get bored with that. Try the second one again, but it doesn't work so well, so we try something else. And sometimes something just appears on its own, like a batch of red color or whatever, some pleasant feeling in the body. If we keep changing and going to something new, again, we're following desire for something pleasant, looking for something pleasant in the practice. And we're basically following that habit of following happiness in order to find relief from boredom. So when something like that arises, I mean, what this person writes is actually quite nice, because you kind of give it some attention just to look at what it is. It feels nice and happy and stuff, but basically let it go and come back to the breath. So you realize, okay, it's just that, and then come back to the breath. Ajahn, you mentioned feeling pain in your chest when you tried to meditate, and you were asked not to. Did the pain go away? I'm having this pain when I try to meditate during the retreat. It never happened before. What should I do? Yeah, the pain basically went away as soon as I stopped trying to meditate. But it was also my efforts in trying to meditate were misguided, and they were really coming from desire. And out of desire, I was trying to use willpower. Like Luang Por was talking today about trying to use willpower to suppress thinking. You can do it every now and again, but it's not sustainable. And willpower has a lot of energy. And what I discovered is, like, at the beginning when I started trying to force the mind to become calm using the breath, I could do that, but the more it was slipping away from me, the more I had to use willpower to hold on to it. And the mind comes up with a lot of energy. And it was that energy, basically I was trying to squeeze the mind into shape through the body, and even though I wasn't squeezing it with my hands, my understanding is I was squeezing so strong with the mind that the body hurt. That's what was happening. And so, just watching the process, I realized, okay, so this is just the result of trying too hard, coming from desire, wanting peace of mind so bad, I'm trying to make it happen out of an act of will. So I had to learn to back off from that. But when you experience pain, like I did this for a while before I realized this is what I was doing. At first I just thought it was the body hurting for some reason. So when pain arises, investigate it. I mean, notice how it affects the mind. Maybe notice where, if it comes up repeatedly, try to look at where it's coming from. It could be because you're maybe sitting on a hard floor and you're not used to it in the tents. If you didn't bring enough padding, that can cause pain. So it would be associated with the retreat, but not necessarily because you're misguided in your efforts to meditate. Or it could be that, but basically you have to, when the pain arises, you have to kind of just look at what are the conditions that arise at the same time that may be causing it, and learning to sort them out. If a bad thought pops up randomly, which we did not want or could even possibly imagine carrying out, shocked we even thought of it in the first place, is that bad karma? No, that's not bad karma. Thoughts are not self, they're conditioned. And you can watch that in the retreats. You're hearing a lot of instructions. A lot of the instructions are being repeated. And then you close your eyes and you sit, and these things come back up in the mind because you just heard them. It's memory just arising, and the cause and conditions are that we're just talking about certain topics. So when a lot of thoughts arising in the mind, a lot of the thinking that arises that we don't intentionally bring up is just vipaka karma. It's just the result of past mental activity that has so much energy in it that it's still coming around, visiting a few times. Where we create karma is when we follow it or try to resist it. Bhava tanha, vibhava tanha. So we're feeding it energy through grasping. It needs to arise, do its thing and cease. That's its nature. It has the causes and conditions exist somewhere in the past, recent or further away. And so the causes for it to arise were already set, and this is the result. When the conditions are right, the result arises. So if we can recognize that and just let it do what it does, meaning it needs to arise, let it arise. But if you don't interact with it and come back to awareness, come back to the breath as an anchor, and just out of the corner of your eye you notice it's there, no, I'm staying here, let it pass. It passes very quickly. And then you're allowing it to cease. And some thoughts or patterns of thinking have more energy to them, so they'll come up again and again and again. If again and again and again we come back to where we take our stand with awareness, with the breath, and you just keep at that and let it cease, eventually its energy will start running out, and it won't be long before it stops coming around to visit. Is the training of knowing here and now a form of cultivation of mindfulness? Yes, it is exactly cultivation of mindfulness. This term mindfulness, I don't know who kind of used it, but probably one of the first translators of Buddha's teachings in Pali into English. And mindfulness is really kind of fully being present. In the general usage of the word mindfulness, like Luang Por was saying, is be mindful when you cross the road so you don't get run over by a car. So it kind of signifies a sense of presence. Be with it. When you cross the road, notice you're crossing the road, pay attention to traffic. So it means basically being present and paying attention. And so cultivating mindfulness is cultivating this ability to be present with things as they are here and now. And so cultivating the knowing, training knowing, we're practicing knowing here and now, knowing the way it is, knowing reality for what it is. In this conditional world, we do things that lead to outcomes. In this circumstance, how does a Buddhist balance such that outcomes are always, it's like this, going on and on? Well, this touches on this idea of this how we plan that I was just talking about. A lot of conditions in life are out of our control. And some of them we have the ability to influence. And for different people, in different ways. Like some people are very, very careful to never eat the wrong types of food and they still get sick. Other people seem to get away with smoking and eating fried food their whole lives and die happily at 95. It's not fair. But that's the way it is. Different kind of karmic causes and conditions for each one of us. So learning just to recognize what reality is. What is this body doing? And if we're able to accept that the body is the body, this body works this way, this mind works this way, the situation, the family we're born in, our parents, our grandparents, our siblings, cousins, children, they're the way they are. And we can interact with them and we can always try our best. So we're always trying to sort of raise children so they become responsible, mature adults who can look after themselves. And if all goes well, it works, but sometimes it doesn't work. And it doesn't mean the parents didn't raise their children correctly. It just means, well, the parent is only one side of the business. The child has his own karma to deal with. He brings his own barami or lack of into this lifetime. So a parent can only give a child his best for the child to thrive, and then the child will do what he can. And sometimes what the child can do makes the parent happy, and then sometimes the child has a mind of its own and the parent starts pulling their hair out. And sometimes it's just really difficult, and some children just turn out to be great disappointment or bring a lot of suffering and difficulties to their parents. So we can't control the outcomes, but what we can do is offer the best conditions possible and remember the future is uncertain and we're not in control of all the conditions that lead to outcomes. We can participate, do our best, and then accept that nature has its own role to play in life. It's like this, it's kind of this acceptance of things the way they are. We try our best, and then if it comes out nicely, it's like this. This is what a pleasant and desirable outcome is like. And then other times we try, it's a complete failure, and to recognize, well, it's like this. I tried, I did my best. It wasn't meant to happen, and to be willing to accept that. So I hope that helps answer that question. Why is good meditation usually praised for its length and duration rather than its quality? Is the quality of meditation so unquantifiable, difficult to assess, such that the only factor that is measurable is by the length and duration? basically, that's what we do. We're thinking creatures. We like to classify and sort things out and say this is good, this is better, this is not so good, this is the worst. That's the function of thinking. That's why we're able to kind of manage the exterior world so well at this last century. All the progress, the material progress, is we're able to discern which is the best quality steel to build skyscrapers and which is the best way to mix cement. And this thinking faculty is very, very useful. What is the best kind of fabric to wear in the cold that repels water and doesn't soak and lets out sweat, and they come up with Gore-Tex and all kinds of things. So this is the function of thinking, is looking at things, discriminating, separating, classifying, good, best, better, and all of that. And so out of a habit of relating to the world in terms of thinking, we take that to the meditation workshop. And how do you say who's meditating well or not well enough? And you say, okay, we'll just go by time. So it's a kind of a natural way of looking at meditation when we're operating from the thinking mind. But the reality of meditation is such that kind of time is really not much of a factor. Like someone asked Luang Por once, is it important to be able to sit for long hours? And he just chuckled and said, well, chickens stay on an egg for many hours, but they don't develop any wisdom. There is a benefit to sitting or trying to push oneself and try sitting for longer periods of time, because that's when defilements and old habits will start manifesting. At the beginning we sit and the body is comfortable. We just came from standing, walking, whatever, and we sit, so it's nice, it's easy. So we're not challenged in any way. And if we want to start to see what the limitations are and where they come from, well, then we have to sit with it and just stay with it and look at what happens. And some people are physically quite fit, quite supple, they're able to sit for a long time, but they suffer from terrible restlessness or sleepiness. Others, they don't have so much of that, but they have a lot of pain in the body, and the body is the limiting factor. And so whatever comes up is going to show us something about the body and the mind. And as that comes up, the reactions that we have out of habit, out of ignorance, are going to be the first ones that come up. And that's where we can start working. Suffering has arisen, welcome to the workshop. That's where we start looking, okay, what's happening here? Like early on in the retreat, I was suggesting that if you feel a little bit of an ache or pain somewhere, don't move right away, just wait a little bit. One, the pain might recede and just disappear. And then you haven't kind of disturbed that process of gentle settling of the mind. But also, sometimes the pain just stays even for the whole hour of the sitting. And you realize that there's a tendency to panic and imagine it's going to get worse and worse. But if you sit with it, you realize actually it doesn't get worse. It just stays like that. I can bear this. I can be with this. And you discover some freedom from the pain. So the pain hasn't gone anywhere, but all of a sudden you're not a slave to the fear that it'll get worse because you've sat with it. But you only discover these things if you sit with it. And then in the practice, when we sit with things, like in this retreat, we sit for 7 days, sit and walk. You learn something after 4 or 5 days that wasn't there on the first day, on the second day, just because you stuck with it. You learn something about how the mind settles with these conditions. You make a bit of an effort, but naturally there's something that happens that you don't have to make happen. It's natural for the mind to settle. So it is useful to learn how to sit and push oneself a little bit, but really the importance of sitting is really understanding what disturbs the mind and how we suffer or create suffering by what arises in the mind and ceases, developing this wisdom. And the tranquility that develops in the practice is what allows us to see clearly. But that's the quality of the meditation, and it's true, you can't measure that. That's pacchatang, one of those qualities of the Dhamma. It's really something only you can know for yourself. So there's a question about whether does one have to sit in full lotus or can one sit on a chair? Of course one can develop wisdom in any posture. Like Satipatthana, the 4 postures, they're all good for developing awareness here and now. So the thing with sitting on the floor oftentimes, especially with the lotus position where you're crossing your legs, giving yourself a good triangular base, and that position kind of pulls just nicely on the hips so that it kind of brings the pelvis in a position that serves as a stable base for the spine. And you can actually sit in a position like that. And it needs effort to be maintained, but it doesn't need much when you've worked your way up to being able to do that. So it's useful in that way. Sitting in a chair is perfectly fine as well, but you also need to be aware how comfortable it is leaning against the back of the chair, and how leaning against the back of the chair, like compared to this, when we sit in full lotus and the body is erect, there is energy needed to maintain it like that, but then the posture lends itself to breathing openly, oxygenating the body well, the energy circulates well, the head is held straight. It's a position of wakefulness, whereas this, the body starts closing in on itself. It's not so wakeful, just the position is not so energetic. So just notice that and notice where the mind is at. Because if the mind is really bright, energetic, you can lean back and it won't affect things because there's a lot of energy in the mind. But sometimes the mind's a bit sluggish and we need to use the body to help energize it. Someone asked a question drawing a picture. That's interesting. So it shows a line with a lot of squiggles on it, and then a flat line, and then squiggles again. And the squiggle is movie time. And then they're asking about the flat bit. Am I dozing, sleeping, or something else? So obviously, I think what this question is conveying is that there's a lot of activity and thinking and showtime, movie time, and then it goes quiet, and they're not sure what's happening. It's if you don't, one good measuring stick is always asking yourself, do I know? Do I know where I'm at? Do I know what's happening? Like when we watch the breath, we're bringing attention on the breath, but then we're also checking that the attention stays on the breath. There's an ability to notice that it starts slipping, or that it's gone, and then we notice it's gone and we bring it back. If there's a period of calm in the practice, in the sitting, and you're not sure what happened, well, what you're sure of is that you don't know. So the knowing wasn't present. And that's the most important part, is this knowing clearly. So I can't tell you whether you're dozing or sleeping or what's happening, but what you can do is just re-establish awareness, and that's why we use a meditation object, because it's clear. I'm going to use the in and out breath for this sitting. Anything else that is not an in-breath or an out-breath is basically a distraction. It can be important, it can be enticing, it can be detestable, it can be dullness, it can be all kinds of things, but it's not the breath. And the moment attention starts drifting to anything else, whatever it is, it's something else than the breath. Come back to the breath. And using something like the breath gives us this sharpness of definition. We can clearly know whether we're with it or we're not. So if periods of meditation go by and then when you come back you go, ooh, was there knowing present? And you can't answer that question confidently, it means there wasn't. So re-establish the mind, clarify the object that you choose to place the attention on here and now, just to sharpen the definition. And then re-establish, reconnect knowing this here and now. And then when the mind starts drifting, even if drifting is kind of drifting towards drowsiness, because you're using a very sharp reference point, when it starts leaving that reference point, you can tell. And then you can start looking at where it's going, and maybe over time you'll be able to tell, well, actually, yeah, it was drowsiness, sleepiness. There's one question is, what does karma follow since there is no self? Well, ultimately there is no self, but when we create one out of ignorance, it's like we're holding on, is really like making a fist. And it's like creating a nucleus to which karma is going to come back to. This is where we create karma from, it comes back to that. So as long as there's grasping, a sense of self, that's where karma comes back to. And then arahants, who've completely let go of any sense of self, but they still speak, they still act, they still think, but they're not creating karma because there's nothing for it to come back to. They're just pure actions. It might be karma for the rest of us because we benefit from it, but for them it's not creating anything that is a basis for rebirth. So I like to think of there is no sense of self, but there is a sense of grasping, and as long as we're grasping, whatever it is that we grasp, and it keeps changing, but there's this grasping going on, that's where things come back to. And when we learn to let go, then things can just flow. The hand is open, something can land and it moves on according to its nature. How do you practice respect and humility in daily conduct and in meditation? Generally, there's kind of a sense of respect, just good manners, but there's a very nice definition of respect that the way Luang Por talks about sila. The sila, in a way, is also good manners, isn't it? And maybe I don't know, it's something that's more peculiar to the West. But sometimes people say they have very low self-esteem, they don't respect themselves. And Luang Por's injunction in those cases is keep sila. Because if we keep sila, we're developing something here that's respectable, that's worthy of respect. Like supatipanno, ujupatipanno, jnanapatipanno, samichipatipanno, practicing full-hearted, we're really putting our heart into it, being genuine, with integrity, in a way that's reflective, where we're looking at what's happening. The qualities that develop in the heart are worthy of respect. And they're not a self. If we start grasping it and sort of being all arrogant about it, then it means we've gone and grasped these qualities, which is not the point. But if we learn to recognize them as it's goodness in the heart, and it is there, and it's worth rejoicing in, not in an egotistical sense of like, wow, look at all the goodness I've got in my heart, but more just like, it is goodness in the heart. And it feels good. And other people respect it. We respect that in other people. People who have a lot of goodness in the heart, we say, this is a really good person. It inspires us, and we feel respect for people like that. And so to learn to recognize that here as well, when we develop goodness in the heart, not to take it personally and make a sense of self out of it, but it is goodness that we're cultivating, and to rejoice in that. And so the sense of humility is there because we're not taking it personally, not creating a sense of self out of it, but it's something very respectable. Qualities in the heart that we learn to respect, cherish, and develop further. It seems like physical distractions, loud sounds, bodily pains, and mental distractions like daydreaming are easier to be aware, but zoning out is harder. I cannot seem to know when I begin to zone out. Any tips for that? Yes, that's a more difficult one to notice. Come back to redefining the object of meditation clearly. Because sometimes what we do is we stay with the breath, and then we start feeling comfortable and cozy and happy, and we relax. And we relax our relationship to the breath. We relax the attention we pay to the breath because, hey, everything's hunky-dory. So we relax and we enjoy. And then lasts for a bit, and then we're so relaxed we start and so it's a very slow, progressive thing. And if we come back to the breath and determine where it is we're going to watch the sensations of the breath, I recommend choosing one place in the body where you're going to watch that, because what I found in this investigating sleepiness and drowsiness, one of the hindrances, I remember Luang Por saying that sometimes there's this, people talk about conquering the kilesas, conquering the hindrances, suppressing them, and it's like all-out war. You're supposed to annihilate them. It's a lot of hard work, and it certainly seems like there's a lot of effort involved, but I'm not always sure about the wisdom. And Luang Por's attitude is, no, these things need to be understood. And referring back to the sutta, the Buddha actually recommends knowing what gives rise to the hindrances, how they arise, how long they last, why they last that long, and then noticing the cessation and what are the conditions that cause the cessation, other than the fact that they're impermanent, like there are things we do that give rise to more of them, make them last longer, or there are things that we can maybe do or refrain from that cause them to arise less and cease faster. So that even the Buddha encourages us to study that. So I had the same problem, not knowing when I was starting to zone out. And so I noticed that if I really start paying attention very closely, defining where I'm going to watch the breath in the body, but then stay open and keep an eye out, because this is a sneaky one. He's going to creep up on you. You don't know from where, you don't know how. So you've got to be very watchful. So you need to be sharp. So you really need to be there on the ball with your meditation object, making sure that you know what's happening, you know your meditation object, you know you're with it, and then just watch. And if you wait long enough, you'll get drowsy. How does it manifest? What are the first signs? What are the starters? What are the little things that come up? And it might be different for all of us, but for myself there are two things. One is the posture starts slumping. I never experience drowsiness when the posture is nice and erect. Relaxed, but erect. So one of them is like it goes from that to this sliding. And then the other thing, my eyelids start feeling heavy, sticky. And I realize that I always assumed that heavy sticky eyelids meant sleepy, you gotta go and sleep. I was surprised by that. It's kind of like, actually it just means heavy sticky eyelids, it doesn't mean anything else. I take it as a sign that I have to go and sleep, so what if I don't? And so I just sit with that. So the position tends to slump, bring it back up. And then it's slumping a lot, so you just keep bringing it back up, keep bringing energy to the process so you don't actually drift. And then I started watching that and I changed my focus from the breath to the sensation in the eyelids. And I was like, I'd like to be able to stay with the sensation of these sleepy eyelids. And rather than give in to sleep, because that's where it usually takes me, stay with awareness of this sensation. So that change the object. The eyelid, the sensation in the eyelids becomes the object. And then try to stay sharp with that. Stay with the knowing, this is a sensation. Consciousness is not sleepy. Consciousness is here and now. If I give in to the sensation and go with these feelings and sensations of sleepiness, then I kind of leave consciousness to its own and I go off into that, and then I fall asleep or drift. But I found that you can stay with this, and then the body goes into a very kind of quiet state. But there's that sense of sharpness staying with the symptoms of whatever it is that leads to drifting away. Try that. Try to investigate. And it's not always the same thing. So sometimes I'm sitting here and I don't have sticky eyelids, and the position tends to slump and then I drift again. So the slumping is one definite sign. Something is coming. But then we can still zone out sometimes sitting straight. And again, it's just this sense of being relaxed and happy. And when we relax, we also relax the attention and the sharpness of the meditation object, how clearly we know it, how clearly we are here and now, not just like in a fuzzy way about now, but really here and now. The same way we can know I'm breathing, and then we pay attention to other things because we checked, we're breathing. Or we can say, no, just like, do you have a full cycle, in breath, out breath? Yeah, and then we move on to something else. So we were present with one cycle and then we went shopping. We're content with having stated, yes, I'm breathing. So we need to sharpen it and say, no, check that I'm staying with each in and out breath. So okay, this one and then that one. And then little by little the mind settles with that. And then you start being happy and you start drifting. So you need to sharpen up. So okay, as the mind settles and becomes quiet, it relaxes, and then I relax my knowing the breath. So I need to sharpen the knowing of the breath. And what you're doing is you're really coming closer to knowing clearly, and you're putting energy into that, using the breath, but the energy is coming into this establishing knowing and really taking that as a stand. So determined to know a complete in-breath, and then to really be there for a complete out-breath. And then when the in-breath starts, determined to be with the full in-breath. And then determined to be with the full out-breath. And then you're really determining to be now, here, now, and kind of repeating that instruction to yourself. And really being with the sensation, and and then little by little it'll even break down into smaller bits. It's like really being with the beginning of the out-breath when it's happening, not just generally fuzzy in-breath as a total thing, but the in-breath feels different. The beginning of the in-breath feels different from the middle parts. The end of the in-breath feels different from the previous two. Can I actually know each one? Really appreciate? So you have to be with it. And the mind slows down and develops this sense of sharpness. And then when you stay with that kind of sharpness, that's being really awake. That's there's energy there. You don't drift. So try doing that. I mean, again, find a way of making it help. It's not kind of just using willpower, then you get a pain in your chest. So finding how to do that in a way that's kind of, again, interesting, challenging, fun, pleasurable, but this is kind of the guideline we're following. Is it true that when a person just passes on, it's not good to cry, as he or she can still sense their loved ones who are left behind? The attachment may land him or her in not a good realm. I've worked for 10 years while I was studying, and the first years when I was working, and my work wasn't full-time yet, I used to work in an old people's home. And noticing those who pass away peacefully and those who pass away with a lot of difficulties. So how the behavior of the relatives has a big impact on the person passing away, whether they're there or not. Sometimes someone is sick and they really look like the body's going to pack in, but it doesn't. They're just waiting for one of their relatives to come and visit. And then that relative comes and the next day they're gone. So these attachments are very important. They affect us while we're living, and then when we're dying, if we haven't let go of our attachments, well, they're still there doing what they do, attaching consciousness to this body. And then oftentimes, even in the best conditions, when the relatives were there and they knew the grandmother or the grandfather was going to pass away any time now, and they want to be with them, holding their hand when they pass away. And then it's time for lunch, so they go for lunch and come back and they're gone. Because oftentimes the relatives who are there, they want to be with grandma or grandpa, but they're really sad that they're dying. And the person passing away knows this, and they can't allow themselves to die in front of this sad person they love, break their heart. And yet they know they have to let go, so when everybody's gone out of the room, that's when they're finally ready to let go and pass away, because they feel that right here and now they're not going to it's not going to affect anybody. They're all off having lunch. So how we behave around people who are dying definitely affects them. One monk told me a very interesting story about having been on Tudong. It was a Western monk who was on Tudong with two Thai monastic friends, and they were up in the jungle, I think up in Chiang Mai or somewhere. And one of the two monks kind of had some knowledge about herbs, Thai herbs and stuff, and decided to make some herbal tea of some sort. And this Western monk became allergic to it, had a reaction to it. Or maybe he just wasn't feeling well, and his friend told him, "Oh, I know what you need, I'll bring you some herbal drink." And anyway, the reaction was a kind of an allergic reaction. And he said, "Oh, I'm really not feeling well, I need to go back to my kuti." So he went back to his kuti, and now the two friends were worried. And they kind of followed him and checked in on him, and he was getting worse and worse, and then he was on his back, not moving, barely breathing. And his description of it was, he'd practiced enough meditation that he had experienced what it is when the mind withdraws from the body. And right there and then, his mind was withdrawing. He started not feeling the body anymore, his eyes were closed, not smelling anything, and the only contact he still had with the body was hearing. And he could hear his two friends talking and started rubbing this kind of camphor mentholated oil all over him, trying to stimulate the body, kind of give the body strong sensations, say, "Don't leave, stay, stay." And at one point, he was really moving away, and he knew he was going to a good place. And then, very faintly, the voice of one of his two friends saying, "If he dies, I'll never forgive myself." And he was back like that. And he's still around. But it's interesting that, because back then that was the reaction, and it was partly out of compassion that he came back, because he didn't want his friend to kind of have to live with this regret for the rest of his life. But it's also a form of attachment. And it's interesting to see, like, that's how much we can affect people who are in the process of dying. So in order to be able to be at peace with a relative who's dying, it's good to anticipate, to prepare ourselves so that we're at peace with the fact that they're going to die. It doesn't mean we're not going to be sad, but we're at peace. And so if we're able to be at the bedside of someone who's passing away, that we can bring that peace. Because that will make them feel at peace. It'll help. It's very important, actually. And if we are kind of bereaved and absolutely drowning in sorrow and stuff like that, then what we're bringing to the deathbed of this person is that. And then they have to cope with not only dying, but dying when one of their beloved is obviously very distraught, and it makes them feel guilty of dying. So it's very beneficial if we can contemplate death until we're comfortable with the idea that these bodies die, is what they do. Contemplate that until we come to a sense of acceptance that this is the nature of the body. We will be separated from those we love. Doesn't mean we won't be sad, but we're at peace with it. And if we can bring that to the deathbed of a relative, of a friend, that's a very beautiful gift we can give them. How to differentiate between perception, mental formation, and sense consciousness. So we're talking about the 5 khandhas. Perception, like this sanya, which we translate by perception, I find it easier to work with what the Thais usually use as a translation, is memory. Perception is made of memory and is conditioned by memory. So they're not quite the same, but memory is easier to work with, at least initially. So we're either blessed or cursed with memory. It's one of the things that happen in the mind. Memories arise and cease. And memories are impermanent. They come and go. And the ability to remember is impermanent. As we get elderly, some of us start losing short-term memory, middle-term memory, and some people just lose it all. So, looking at memory instead of trying to figure out perception is initially a much easier way to relate to this 3rd khandha. Mental formations is a bit of a kind of a, what do you call it? As a kind of a basket in which everything that doesn't fit in the other categories you can chuck into this one. Because the other 4 categories are easier to define. Like the body is this thing, feelings are precisely those feelings of pleasure or pain, or neither pleasure or pain, neutral feelings that are associated with every sense contact, every contact through the 6 sense doors. Is that aspect of the experience. Then sanya is memory. Sense consciousness is the way we experience consciousness through the senses. So looking at you now, with the eye, like this kind of, with the way the Buddha describes it, you need an object of the sense, you need an organ that's working, and consciousness. And when the 3 come together, you have seeing. And we call it eye consciousness. the consciousness is not specific to the eye, but in this case we're experiencing consciousness through the experience of seeing. Hearing consciousness, it's all the same consciousness. It's a little bit like some of those investment bankers who have 5 screens in front of them. They're sitting in the chair kind of collecting all the data that comes in through these 5 different channels, but it all comes to this person sitting there. And that's what consciousness is. And when he's looking at I don't know finance, so I'm not very good at giving examples about this, but when it's about one aspect of the market, then it's kind of hedge fund. He's the hedge fund guy. And then he switches to do pension investments, so he's the pension guy. It's always the same guy, but he has these different portfolios. And that's how we call eye consciousness, ear consciousness, and hearing consciousness, and all of that. But really, consciousness is just consciousness, but it's the way we experience it through seeing, through hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and then thinking and emotions and all of that. So what are mental formations? The term is kind of already a pretty decent hint, is all these things that form in the mind, all these creations in the mind, views, thinking, emotions, they're all kind of fabricated and constructed inside and appear in the mind. But generally speaking, I think of mental formations mostly as thinking, emotions, and moods. It pretty much covers it all. Luang Por mentioned while he has physical pain, there's no pain mentally. Is this considered liberation? Yes, it's freedom. The freedom to allow the body to experience pain, but not reacting to it out of desire for it to cease, or even if the desire arises, the awareness informed by wisdom knows this is pain, and this is wanting it not to be there, but knowing that pain is just pain, desire is just desire, and knowing not to get involved with either. And the refuge of awareness, of knowing, informed by wisdom, is just so strong, there's no need to go out and interfere with it. The pain is impermanent, it'll cease, and then when pain ceases, any desire for it not to be there ceases as well, because it's conditioned by the arising of pain. But with practice, that desire for it not to be there arises less and less often. So the night after he got all this surgery done on his head, before he went to bed, I was kind of really concerned because it was a lot of surgery. So I went to check on him as he was going to bed, and he said, "No, I'm fine. I'm really fine." Like, okay, well, the doctor gave him all this paracetamol in case he needed it. And then the next morning he slept in until about 9 o'clock. So I let him rest because obviously he needed it. But then when I checked in on him, I asked him, how did it go? And he said, well, it was excruciating pain. And the paracetamol didn't do anything. And he couldn't sleep until 4 in the morning. And then from 4 to 5 he slept, but then he woke up again because of the pain. The head was all swollen and tight. But he was completely relaxed as he was telling me this. He wasn't complaining, he was just telling me what the night was like. And he actually said, it's so nice to have awareness as a refuge. Because as awareness as a refuge, pain is just pain. And he knows it's going to end, so he doesn't waste any energy trying to resist it or complain about it or anything like that. So the more we develop this awareness and understanding the nature of the body, of the mind, the more we develop this, the more solid this refuge becomes, the more reliable it is, to such a point that it's possible to spend a whole night with excruciating pain on the head and just patiently endure it without being disturbed by it. It's just the body that's in pain. It's like Luang Por Ben, when he was dying, he had cancer, and he got some herbal medicine for it, some herbal treatment, and it disappeared, but then it came back. And Ajahn Asoko and one of his dear friends, Luang Por Mahabunlert, were at his bedside just the day before he died, or 2 days before he died. And Luang Por Mahabunlert was like a son to Luang Por Ben, very, very strong bond. And it was a very moving scene, because it was a little bit like the Buddha and Ananda. Luang Por Ben was on his bed, just talking Dhamma as he usually does, but not very much, because he was in a lot of pain and very tired. And Ajahn Asoko was just asking if there's anything they could do, and Luang Por Mahabunlert was crying because his very, very beloved teacher was dying, and Luang Por Ben would kind of tap him on the head and says, don't worry, it's okay. And Ajahn Asoko he knew that in doctors like to try to evaluate pain. And he was curious to know where Luang Por Ben's pain was at, because he's such a highly realized being. He was wondering, what is he even going through? We can probably not imagine it. So he asked him, Luang Por Ben, on 11 from 1 to 10, 10 being the worst, where's your pain at? And Luang Por Ben looked at him with a smile and he said, about 1,000. That's freedom. That's liberation. Okay, so it is 9 o'clock. I think we'll end here today.